"We're going to back up slowly and get back on the road," he announced. "Everyone stay seated, seatbelts on." What followed was a demonstration of vehicle handling that defied belief. Bob managed to reverse a 40-foot bus off an icy embankment and back onto the road with movements so precise that it looked effortless. Sarah, who'd seen her share of skilled drivers, realized she was watching something extraordinary. As they continued toward school, Sarah found herself studying Bob with new eyes. The way he held his shoulders suggested years of wearing heavy gear. The way he scanned the road looked less like defensive driving and more like route reconnaissance. The way he'd handled the emergency had been textbook crisis management, but not the kind they taught in civilian driver education courses. "Mr. Henderson," she said carefully, "that was incredible driving back there." Bob glanced in the rearview mirror, making eye contact briefly. "Just doing my job, ma'am." "Have you had special training?" Another pause. "Some." Sarah decided to take a chance. "Military training?" This time, the pause was longer. When Bob finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. "Long time ago." "What branch?" "Army." "What did you do in the Army?" Bob checked his mirrors again, though Sarah suspected it was more about buying time than checking traffic. "Transportation," he said finally. It was a careful answer, technically true but deliberately vague. Sarah sensed there was much more to the story, but before she could ask another question, they'd arrived at Roosevelt Elementary. Bob pulled into the designated drop-off zone with his usual precision, activated the parking brake, and turned to address his passengers. "Everyone have a good day," he said, opening the door. "Watch the wet spots on the sidewalk." As the children filed off the bus, chattering about their morning adventure, Sarah lingered. "Mr. Henderson, thank you for getting us here safely. That could have been much worse." Bob looked at her directly for the first time that morning. "That's what training is for, Miss Chen. Preparing for things you hope never happen." Sarah spent the rest of the morning thinking about Bob's response and the way he'd handled the emergency. During her lunch break, she found herself in the school library, researching Army transportation units. What she discovered made her even more curious. Army transportation wasn't just about moving supplies from point A to point B. Modern military transportation involved convoy operations, route security, defensive driving in hostile environments, and vehicle recovery under fire. The drivers who conducted these missions were highly trained soldiers who'd learned their skills in places where making a mistake could get people killed. That afternoon, as Sarah waited for her ride home, she watched Bob conduct his post-trip inspection with new understanding. Every movement was purposeful, every check was thorough, and the whole process followed a pattern that looked suspiciously like military procedure. When Bob finished his inspection and began walking toward the parking lot, Sarah made a decision that would change both their lives. "Mr. Henderson," she called out, jogging to catch up with him. He turned, surprised to see her following him. "Miss Chen? Everything all right?" "I wanted to ask you something," she said, slightly out of breath. "About this morning. About your Army service." Bob's expression became guarded. "What about it? You said you were in transportation, but what you did today, that wasn't just regular truck driving, was it?" Bob studied her face for a long moment, as if deciding how much truth she could handle. "What makes you think that?" "The way you handled the emergency. The way you assessed the situation. The way you recovered the vehicle." Sarah paused. "My father was in the Marines. I grew up around military people. What I saw today was combat-level training." Bob was quiet for so long that Sarah began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Iraq," he said. "Afghanistan. 25 years total. Convoy operations, mostly. Moving supplies, equipment, personnel." He paused. "Sometimes moving them through places where people were trying to kill us." Sarah felt something shift in her understanding of the man she'd been riding with for 3 years. You were a convoy commander? Staff Sergeant. Motor transport operator, officially. But yeah, I ran convoys. Lot of them. For 25 years? Bob nodded. Enlisted in '78, retired in 2003. Did my time in Bosnia, Somalia, Gulf War, then Iraq and Afghanistan after September 11th. Sarah was quiet, processing the magnitude of what he'd just shared. And then you became a school bus driver? Seemed like a natural transition, Bob said with the faintest hint of a smile. Still transportation. Still responsible for getting people where they need to go safely. Just quieter routes. Have you ever told anyone at the school about your service? Bob shook his head. Never came up. They needed a driver, I needed a job. Background check cleared, references were good. Nobody asked about the details. But don't you think people would want to know? Don't you think they'd be interested in your experience? Bob looked toward the school building, where a few teachers were still leaving for the day. What would I tell them? That I spent 25 years driving through places where any corner could hide an IED? That I learned to read terrain for ambush points and escape routes? That I can strip and rebuild a transmission in the dark because I had to do it under fire? He paused, choosing his words carefully. These folks see an old guy who drives their kids to school. That's enough. They don't need to know about the other stuff. Sarah understood, but something about his resignation bothered her. But you're still using those skills. What you did today, that probably saved our lives. Maybe, Bob said. Or maybe I just got lucky. That wasn't luck, Mr. Henderson. That was training and experience. That was 25 years of being responsible for people's lives in situations a lot more dangerous than a snowy road in upstate New York. Bob looked at her with something that might have been gratitude. Most people don't want to think about that stuff. They want to believe their kids are safe because the world is safe, not because someone with combat experience is watching out for them. Maybe they should know, Sarah said. Maybe they should understand what kind of person is taking care of their children. That evening, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about her conversation with Bob. She did more research, digging into the history of convoy operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. What she found was sobering. Convoy duty had been one of the most dangerous assignments in both conflicts. The drivers who'd kept supply lines open had faced constant threats from improvised explosive devices, ambushes, and sniper attacks. Many hadn't made it home. The next morning, Sarah was waiting at the bus stop earlier than usual. When Bob pulled up, she climbed aboard and took the same seat near the front. Good morning, Mr. Henderson. Morning, Miss Chen. As they drove through town, Sarah noticed things she'd never paid attention to before. The way Bob positioned the bus at stop signs to maintain visibility in all directions. The way he varied his route slightly each day, never taking exactly the same path twice. The way his eyes constantly moved, scanning for potential threats that would never materialize in peaceful Millbrook but might have meant the difference between life and death in Fallujah or Kandahar. Can I ask you something? Sarah said as they approached the school. Sure. Do you miss it? The army? Bob considered the question seriously. Miss the people, he said finally. Miss the mission. Miss knowing that what you're doing matters. What you're doing now matters. Bob smiled, the first genuine smile Sarah had seen from him. Yeah, it does. Just different. How different? Back then, success meant everyone got home alive. Now, success means everyone gets to school on time and learns something. He paused. Both missions matter. This one's just quieter. Over the following weeks, Sarah began to see Bob's work with new eyes. The way he knew every child's name, even though he rarely used them. The way he positioned himself to keep an eye on the school entrance while buses were loading. The way he'd somehow convinced 30 elementary school children to follow safety protocols without ever raising his voice or making threats. She also began to notice things that suggested Bob's past was more complex than even he'd admitted. The way he instinctively moved to put himself between the children and any potential threat. The way his hand positioned near the radio whenever unexpected vehicles appeared. The way he conducted what looked suspiciously like counter-surveillance measures during routine drives around town. One afternoon, Sarah decided to do more research. She'd been thinking about Bob's service record and wondering what convoy operations had really meant for someone who'd served from 1978 to 2003. That span covered some of the most intense periods of modern military history. What she found in declassified records and military history websites painted a picture of someone who'd been far more than just a driver. Staff sergeants who'd run convoy operations in Iraq and Afghanistan had been responsible for mission planning, route security, vehicle maintenance, personnel management, and tactical decision-making under fire. They'd been leaders, not just drivers. Sarah also discovered something else. Bob's service had coincided with some of the most dangerous periods for convoy operations. The time frame he'd mentioned meant he'd been in Iraq during the initial invasion and the subsequent insurgency, when convoy attacks had been a daily occurrence. The more she learned, the more impressed she became with Bob's transition to civilian life. Many veterans struggled with the adjustment from high-stakes military operations to routine civilian work. But Bob had found a way to channel his protective instincts and leadership skills into a role that served his community while maintaining the sense of mission that had defined his military service. 2 weeks after the ice incident, Principal Martinez called Sarah into his office. "I understand you've been getting to know our bus driver," he said. Sarah wondered if she'd somehow gotten Bob in trouble. "Is there a problem?" "No, not at all. Actually, I wanted to ask you about something. We've had Bob for 14 years, and he's been absolutely reliable. Never an incident, never a complaint, always professional. But I realized recently that we don't know much about his background. What would you like to know?" "Well, yesterday I was talking to Chief Sullivan from the police department, and he mentioned that someone had called in a report of expert vehicle recovery on Highway 9 a few weeks ago. Said it looked like military-level driving. When I checked the date, it matched up with the day you rode Bob's bus." Sarah chose her words carefully. "Mr. Henderson handled the situation very professionally." "I'm sure he did. But Chief Sullivan was curious about something. He said the caller described the driver's technique as combat-level vehicle recovery. Those were his exact words." Sarah remained silent, unsure how much Bob would want her to share. Principal Martinez leaned back in his chair. "Sarah, I've been running this school for 15 years. I've seen a lot of drivers come and go. Bob Henderson is something special. The way he manages those kids, the way he handles the vehicle, the way he's never had so much as a minor incident, that's not just experience. That's training." "What are you asking me?" "I'm asking if there's something about Bob's background that would explain why 30 elementary school kids respect him without him ever raising his voice. Something that would explain why he can parallel park a 40-foot bus in a space that would challenge most professional drivers. Something that would explain why he handled an emergency with the kind of calm professionalism that impressed a police chief." Sarah realized that Bob's secret was becoming harder to keep. "You'd have to ask him directly." "I intend to. But I wanted to talk to you first, because I get the feeling you know more than you're saying." That afternoon, Sarah warned Bob about her conversation with Principal Martinez. "He's starting to ask questions." Bob sighed. "Figured this would happen eventually. Can't do the job right without using the skills, and using the skills makes people curious." "Are you worried?" "Not really. Just prefer to keep things simple." "What will you tell him?" Bob smiled. "The truth. Some of it, anyway." The next morning, Principal Martinez was waiting in the bus loading zone when Bob arrived. Sarah watched from her classroom window as the two men talked for nearly 20 minutes. She couldn't hear what was being said, but she could see body language that suggested mutual respect and understanding. Later that day, Principal Martinez called an all-staff meeting. Sarah wondered if Bob was about to be publicly exposed, but what happened was something she hadn't expected. "I want to share something with all of you," the principal began. "For 14 years, we've had the privilege of having Mr. Bob Henderson as our primary bus driver. What I learned today is that Mr. Henderson is a retired Army Staff Sergeant with 25 years of military service, including multiple deployments to combat zones." There was a murmur of surprise from the staff. Sarah looked around and saw genuine interest and respect on her colleagues' faces. "Mr. Henderson asked me to emphasize that he doesn't want any special treatment or recognition. He said he's just doing his job. But I think it's important for us to understand that our children are being transported by someone with the highest level of professional training and experience." After the meeting, several teachers approached Sarah with questions about Bob. Word spread quickly through the parent network, and by the end of the week, Bob found himself receiving more recognition than he'd had in 14 years. The change was subtle but noticeable. Parents who'd never bothered to learn his name now greeted him personally. Teachers who'd given him perfunctory waves now stopped to chat. Children who'd taken his presence for granted began asking questions about the Army and what it was like to drive big trucks. Bob handled the attention with typical grace, answering questions when asked but never volunteering information. Sarah could see that he was somewhat uncomfortable with the recognition, but also that he appreciated being seen as more than just the bus driver. 1 month after the ice incident, Sarah received a letter that would change her perspective on Bob's story forever. It was from a parent she'd never met, a woman named Linda Morrison whose son had graduated from Roosevelt Elementary 5 years earlier. "Dear Miss Chen," the letter began, "I heard through the parent network that you've gotten to know Mr. Henderson, our former bus driver. I wanted to share something with you that I've never told anyone at the school. 5 years ago, my son Jake was being bullied by some older kids at the bus stop. Mr. Henderson never said anything directly, but somehow the situation resolved itself. It wasn't until years later that Jake told me what had happened. One morning, when the bullying was at its worst, Mr. Henderson had quietly asked Jake to sit in the front seat. As they drove to school, he'd told Jake a story about a young soldier who'd been picked on by his squad until he'd proven himself through courage and determination. He'd never mentioned Jake's situation directly, but the message was clear: stand up for yourself, don't give up, and remember that sometimes the people who seem the toughest are just scared. But the real intervention came later. Mr. Henderson had somehow identified the older kids who were causing problems, and he'd had individual conversations with each of them. Again, no direct confrontation, no threats, just quiet talks about leadership, responsibility, and taking care of people smaller than yourself. Within a week, the bullying had stopped completely. Not only that, but one of the former bullies had actually become Jake's protector. When I asked Jake how Mr. Henderson had accomplished this, he said, he didn't tell them to stop being mean. He told them how to be leaders instead. Miss Chen, I don't know what Mr. Henderson's military service involved, but I know it taught him something about leadership that goes far beyond driving a bus. My son learned lessons from that man that have served him well in high school and will serve him well in life. I wanted you to know this because I think teachers should understand that Mr. Henderson isn't just keeping our children safe on the road. He's teaching them about character, even though they don't realize they're being taught." Sarah shared the letter with Bob the next morning. As he read it, she could see emotions crossing his face that she'd never seen before. "That's what leadership really is," Bob said finally. "Not telling people what to do, but helping them figure out who they want to be. Is that what you learned in the Army?" "That's what I learned from good sergeants who cared more about their soldiers than they did about looking tough. Took me a few years to figure it out myself." As the school year progressed, Sarah began to understand that Bob's story was more complex than even she'd imagined. His transition from military service to civilian life hadn't just been about finding a job that used his driving skills. It had been about finding a way to continue serving, to continue being responsible for people's safety, to continue making a difference in a world that had changed around him. She also began to realize that Bob's influence extended far beyond the children on his bus. His quiet professionalism had set a standard that affected everyone at Roosevelt Elementary. Teachers were more punctual because Bob was never late. Parents were more respectful because Bob treated everyone with dignity. Children were better behaved because Bob had somehow convinced them that good behavior was a choice they made for themselves, not a rule imposed by adults. On the last day of school, Sarah decided to ask Bob the question that had been on her mind for months. "Mr. Henderson, do you ever regret leaving the Army?" Bob was conducting his end-of-day inspection, checking the bus with the same thoroughness he'd shown every day for 14 years. He paused, considering the question seriously. "Regret's the wrong word," he said finally. "I was ready to come home. 25 years is enough time in harm's way. But I needed to find something that mattered, something that used what I'd learned." "And you found it here?" Bob looked toward the school building, where teachers were saying goodbye to students and parents were collecting artwork and report cards. "Every morning, 30 kids get on this bus trusting that I'll get them where they need to go safely. Every afternoon, 30 families trust that I'll bring their children home. That's a mission worth doing. Even if most people don't understand what that mission really involves." Bob smiled. "Most of my Army missions were classified. People couldn't know about them even if they wanted to. This mission isn't classified, but it doesn't need to be. The parents see their kids come home safe every day. The kids learn that there are adults they can count on. That's enough." Sarah realized that Bob had found something that eluded many veterans, a way to continue serving that honored his past while building a meaningful future. He'd taken the skills he'd learned in combat and applied them to protecting children instead of soldiers, to building character instead of just completing missions. As she watched Bob finish his inspection and walk toward the parking lot, Sarah understood that she'd been privileged to witness something extraordinary. Not just the story of a veteran's transition to civilian life, but a masterclass in quiet leadership, professional excellence, and service without recognition. Bob Henderson had spent 25 years keeping soldiers alive in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. For the past 14 years, he'd been keeping children safe on the roads of upstate New York. Both missions had required the same core skills: vigilance, preparation, calm under pressure, and an unwavering commitment to bringing everyone home safely. The only difference was that now, instead of convoy briefings and route reconnaissance, he had permission slips and field trip schedules. Instead of armored vehicles and radio checks, he had school buses and emergency drills. Instead of bronze stars and commendation letters, he had thank you notes from parents and Christmas cards from former students. And instead of being forgotten after retirement like too many veterans, Bob Henderson had found a way to continue being the kind of person his military service had taught him to be, someone you could count on when it mattered most. Most heroes don't get parades. They don't get their names in newspapers or their stories told on television. They get up every morning, put on their uniforms, whether they're military fatigues or bus driver polo shirts, and do whatever job needs doing with professionalism, dignity, and quiet excellence. Bob Henderson had been that kind of hero for 39 years. For 25 of those years, he'd served his country in uniform. For 14 more, he'd served his community without one. The mission had changed, but the commitment hadn't. And every day, 30 children learned something valuable from watching him work, even though they didn't realize they were being taught. They learned that some adults can be trusted completely. They learned that competence and kindness aren't mutually exclusive. They learned that real strength is quiet, real leadership is gentle, and real heroes don't need recognition to keep doing the right thing. Bob Henderson never told his students that he was a veteran. He never shared stories of his military service or explained what convoy operations in Iraq really meant. But every day, through his actions, he taught them lessons that would serve them for the rest of their lives. Sometimes the most important stories are the ones that never get told. Sometimes the greatest teachers are the ones who never raise their voices. And sometimes the biggest heroes are the ones driving yellow school buses, making sure everyone gets where they need to go safely, one day at a time. Staff Sergeant Robert Henderson, U.S. Army, retired. Roosevelt Elementary School bus driver. Quiet professional. Silent hero. The kind of man who makes the world a little safer just by being in it.